My name is Ayana Beth. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Southern California. And this project is actually my dissertation project, or a portion of my dissertation project. So it's definitely a work in progress. So bear with me with that. That's just to keep in mind. Okay, so my research project um, is motivated by the increase of Black women murdered by police officers. However, our stories and our voices are not heard as much in movements like BLM. So I just want to point out these statistics first. So Black women are 17 times more likely to be pulled over by police officers than white women, and 34 times more likely to be pulled over than Latina women. Black women are also 3 times more likely to be arrested during these traffic stops, whereas white women are then more than 3 times more than white women, and twice as likely to be arrested than Latina women. And in 2015, Black women accounted for 28% of all the unarmed murders by police officers. However, we only make up about 6% of the population. Um, so my research questions stem from these assumptions that Black women are invisible in the conversations around police violence and police murders. So my primary research question is, how does race and gender affect the ways in which Black women mobilize against police violence in their communities? Do instances of police violence lead to a stronger sense of group consciousness amongst these women? How does police violence affect Black women's political participation, more importantly? And how does proximity to police violence affect their political behavior? So I have quite a few hypotheses. However, these are the primary ones that I'm focusing on with my methodology, which I will talk about a little bit later. But basically, this is an intersectional project. So I'm focusing on Black women as um, uh, how their race, both their race and their gender, is affecting their group consciousness and their political participation at the same time. So controlling for other factors, including socioeconomic status, age, education, etc. Do Black women with a stronger sense of group consciousness mobilize more effectively against police, or not more effectively, but mobilize against police more frequently in their community in both traditional and non-traditional ways? Also, controlling for all other factors, does direct violence affect their, not only their group consciousness, but their likeliness to mobilize against police violence in their community? And when I say direct, I mean they're specifically, or as an individual, they were affected by police violence, whether it be sexual, verbal, or physical assault by an officer themselves, versus proximal contact, where it's a family member or a loved one or a friend who was affected by police violence, and does that mobilize them more than actual direct violence? So this is my theoretical framework and how I'm thinking about police violence. As I just stated with the hypotheses, I think, or I theorize, that there will be a difference between whether the police contact is direct, actual personal contact, or it's indirect, where it's your familial or friendship ties that are affected by this, whether you're mobilized. I also think that the types of interactions matter for stemming this experience and this group consciousness that I'm talking about. And how Black women are mobilized is important as well, whether it be through constant access to media or social media, where they're finding out about these interactions, and how there's nothing being done, or how where they don't see Black women in these instances. However, they see it from a personal standpoint. So will that affect whether they mobilize or whether they turn out? And then these are the different types of political participation that I'm discussing, which are both traditional, as in voting, or non-traditional, as in grassroots organizing and protesting. So some of the relevant literature that I discussed in the project are the idea of a Black group consciousness, or more specifically, a Black feminist consciousness, which a number of scholars, including Patricia Hill Collins, Kimberly Crenshaw, um, Catherine Tate, and Claudine Gay, et cetera, discuss Black women's relation to their community through the experiences and the historical references that they have, and how this affects their group identity and their willingness to combat issues or threats to that group, as well as policing literature that discusses the innate practices and the structures of policing that lead to more sexist and racist actions on behalf of police officers, and what is political participation and what that looks like for Black women versus what that looks like for other groups, through more traditional scholarship, including Miller et al. And Campbell, Verba, and I, et cetera. So more specifically, when we're discussing criminal justice contact and political science and how that relates to political participation, there seems to be two schools of thought, or two one debate about on two sides. So scholars who talk about more of a negative relationship discuss how criminal justice, or contact with criminal justice, whether indirect or direct, represses folks' political participation. So Tracy Birch, as well as Weaver and Lerman discuss how constant contact with the criminal justice system, whether it be your loved ones, makes you less likely to participate politically, versus other scholars who discuss proximal contact with police officers bolsters your political participation, and is actually more like you're more likely to get involved because your loved ones are affected. So Walker and Castillon, 2014, or Walker just released a book in 2020 talking about mobilizing injustice. It's titled "Mobilizing Injustice," and it discusses how women, or not just women, but the example is primarily women. Women are more mobilized through their loved ones when they have this constant contact with the criminal justice system, and they need to fight for them because they're not able to advocate for themselves in many instances. So for this project, I use a mixed method approach. I have access to the 2020 CNPS, or the Collaborative Multiracial Post-Election Survey, done out of UCLA. And with that data, I will do a multivariate regression to see how Black women are responding to policing and questions like BLM more broadly, and how that is affecting whether they participate politically or not. And then I have fielded a survey, and this will be a nationally representative survey. I'm hoping to get at least 1,000 respondents. I have about 500 so far, so that's a good start. And I'm using a snowballing method. So attempting to use different networks to get engaged Black women in this survey. And then after I collect all of the survey respondents, I plan to conduct semi-structured interviews with between 15 to 20 Black women from these different regions to get a more nuanced, or to start a more nuanced conversation about the questions that are asked in the pilot survey. And I'll just briefly go through some of the questions that I'm addressing and some of the things I'm trying to get at with the survey that I created. So these questions are primarily getting at a group consciousness, idea of group consciousness and linked fate. So I asked, when you speak about Black women, how often do you use or do you say we instead of they? How do Black women engage in, or how do they feel about being a part of this identity group, or this being a Black woman, essentially? And so far, most Black women are use the term we always. Another question that I ask is, how much do we think that what generally happens to Black women in this country will affect what happens to them specifically? And this is to get at the idea of a linked fate, or Dawson's idea of a linked fate for Black women specifically. And the answers on this actually vary. So I think that'll be interesting to tease out later on. And then asking specifically about folks' experience, or Black women's experience with proximal and direct contact of police violence. So asking them if they've experienced police violence, or if they know of their family members who have experienced police violence. And then finally getting at their sentiments about police may be engaging, because they may be engaging with different media types, or however their family members may be employed by police officers, or they themselves are employed as police officers, because policing, or being a police officer actually in the Black community has been seen as a way to social mobility and to the middle class. So asking questions about employment with police departments. And then the semi-structured interview, these are kind of the samples to get at of those questions in a deeper level. So asking them about how they feel about, family and their children, and if they're worried about police violence, and how does their community look? How do their representatives affect, or what do they feel their representatives do well about policing in their community, or need to do better or do poorly, essentially. So the next steps, I'm still, as I was stated before, collecting the data and going through it and analyzing it. So if you would like to take the survey, if you're a Black woman and you would like to take the survey, please do, or share it, or however that may be. And if you have any other questions, please let me know. And this is my email address. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Best. A very, very great topic. And I'm so excited to see that you've looked at Black feminist consciousness from Patricia Hill Collins. Actually, Dr. Samuels and I just chaired, one of our students utilized her Black feminist consciousness as a theoretical framework, where we looked at how gender and the intersectionality of race and gender plays a pivotal role in how Black women actually in their thought process within their consciousness in a lot of different ways. So I'm very excited to see that you're utilizing that. I'm at this time going to open the floor for discussion.
Dr. Johnson.
To see if anyone has any. Yes.
Let's get the other presenters first, and then we will.
Okay.
And then we'll ask you to make your comments on the paper.
We'll come back.
And then we'll come back.
Okay. We'll come back. Sounds great. Thank you.
Come back.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay.
Yeah. thank you for that. And I'm going to ask. Okay. At this time, I'm going to ask our our let's see our next presenter. Our next presenter. Uh, in this case, will be Dr. Anthony Lindsay, and he hails from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Tar Heels, and he'll be presenting on socio-political bifurcation, the unconscious conflict driving disproportionate Black imprisonment. Dr. Lindsay, the floor is yours.
Cheers, thank you. Not doctor, not yet. One day though, hopefully. I'm
Okay.
just, I'm a second year graduate student at UNC, but
Okay.
it
I'm a,
sounds
I'm a
really
little ahead.
good though. I like
I'm a
the
little
ring
ahead.
of doctor. I'm
We're
gonna
gonna speak
try
it
to.
into existence.
Yeah, I appreciate that. All right. All right, cool. Is everyone able to see this? Okay. The PowerPoint. Maybe not. Okay, cool. All right. All right, cool. This is the theory of socio-political bifurcation. So I'm essentially like looking at the triadic relationship between segregation, black crime, and the disproportionate incarceration of African Americans. And the connection between segregation and black crime, I think, is a two-way relationship. But I'll get to that like later on. Kind of like as a background to this epidemic, the from night well not necessarily the beginning, but in the middle, from 1980 to 1996, the prison population in the United States went from 300,000 to over a million. But the change wasn't proportionate between the races. African Americans experienced a 261% increase, and white Americans saw a 185% increase. And the situation like later on got progressively worse. In before then, the disproportionality in sentencing was already significant. So scholars have examined the epidemic for some time, and we tried to delineate the causal mechanisms behind this incarceration pipeline. So there's several theories as to why the phenomenon is occurring, but broadly speaking, they fall into two schools of thought. Which are not necessarily disconnected, but I think it's like a cool conceptualization of the literature. The first school of thought examines the sociological and historical backdrop that led to the current situation. The 339 years of African American slavery, followed by 89 years of segregation and Jim Crow, certainly has an impact just 66 years after the cessation of de jure segregation. So that's an obvious place to start, as it would be fairly difficult to pretend that like 400 years of systemic oppression kind of disappeared overnight. And the vestiges of slavery can be seen in the economic disparity in the Black community, the makeup in the police forces, um, and the overall institutional barriers that African Americans face that contribute to the disproportionate incarceration of African Americans. The economic situation in particular, where African Americans were held back from owning property and consequently couldn't pass down the primary source of wealth in the United States, was a huge factor. Now, the second school of thought examines the institutional barriers, housing and lending, disproportionate sentencing, disparities in education and housing, and the overpolicing of Black communities, which fall into that category. But the lines between the two schools of thought are a bit blurred. For instance, how do you explain the economic disparity without considering chattel slavery? How do you explain the lack of Black politicians without accounting for the institutional barriers, things like that? And these are only a few of the factors leading to the over incarceration of African Americans. And there's a lot more. But the scholars have examined the ameliorative capacity of Black representation in college enrollment, which we are doing extraordinarily well in. But I think that the problem can really be beat with just these tactics. I think there's another phenomenon, a sociological phenomenon that's driving this modern problem. Um, so I think that the modern issue is with segregation. Um, while it certainly has its roots in slavery and de jure segregation, there's an equally nefarious but potentially unconscious phenomenon that's driving this modern segregation. So when citizens decide on which neighborhood they'll sort into, they consider several things. Among the myriad of causes behind like individual sorting preferences, we know that people are likely to sort in neighborhoods that are ethnically homogenous. So when they're faced with the decision, should I go into a neighborhood that matches my ethnic background or ethnic makeup versus like a community that is not my ethnicity, they typically choose their own in the aggregate. They also sort into communities that match their socioeconomic status. So if they are wealthy, they typically gravitate towards neighborhoods that match their level of income, and they also gravitate towards neighborhoods they deem are safer. So, given the ethnic clustering of African Americans, their lower socioeconomic standing, and the criminality in lower income neighborhoods, when white Americans decide upon their neighborhood, they gravitate away from minority communities. So, sort of as an example of how these sorting pressures leads to segregation. And it doesn't necessarily have to be an unconscious process, but I do think that there is some conscious things that are going on in the background. So I know of a professor whose parents decided where their neighborhood would be based on the quality of the schools. Now, in California is where this happened, but in a lot of localities throughout the US, schools funding is tied to local property values. Since white Americans have higher property values, the school system in predominantly white communities have higher funding. So wealthier people gravitate to those schools, and the overall school system becomes progressively more stratified. So this feedback within the larger system, this larger complex system, is evident as people like relocate based on the quality of the schools as just one of the factors, and they inevitably converge along economic lines and ethnic lines. So in the case of my professor's parents, their decision to move to an area with the best schools also contributed to this modern segregation process. However unconscious it may be, white Americans still segregate away from poor Black communities, leaving African Americans clustered in low-income areas. But intuitively, education would ameliorate the process. But I don't think that's the case. So my theory is that it only catalyzes the sorting preference. So when individuals attend a university, their potential earnings and socioeconomic standing increases. And after they graduate, they're faced with the same decision that they had before they attended a university. Consequently, they go through the same process of sorting where they are affected by in-group affinity, the socioeconomic standing of the neighborhood, and their safety, except this time they have higher socioeconomic standing. So they're faced with even more pressure. So as a direct result, on having been essentially on many levels left behind, is the increase in criminality within the neighborhood. Um, so yeah, like as a result of the I suppose the ethnic and socioeconomic coagulation, crime increases for the communities that are left behind. Poverty, over policing, disproportionate sentencing, clustering of African Americans in high crime neighborhoods begets more poverty, more policing, and more solidification of the entire system. The end product of which is the disproportionate incarceration of African Americans. Now, within this complex system, criminality only adds to the feedback pressure of segregation, as it becomes just another factor that people consider when they're choosing their neighborhood. So it increases the sorting pressures that started the whole pipeline. Now, this triadic relationship between segregation, criminality, and the disproportionate incarceration of African Americans is what I've deemed a socio-political bifurcation. But specifically, a socio-political bifurcation is when segregation induces more crime. Crime has a feedback on the segregation process, and they both lead to higher levels of segregation. I mean, higher levels of Black incarceration. So to test it, I did 3 tests. The first one, this one, was a means test of a propensity score matching. So I matched states based upon these 4 factors: their college enrollment, income, poverty, and urbanization. And I wanted to see if the neighborhoods with high levels of segregation versus areas with low levels of segregation had higher or lower levels of Black incarceration. And it did. So the states with matching upon all of these factors, states with higher levels of segregation had higher levels of Black incarceration. So yeah, and then the second test was a mixed effects multi-level logistic regression, where essentially I wanted to see what were the effect, what was the effects of this interaction across the spectrum. So as segregation increased, notice that the relationship at low levels of segregation, Black crime is the bigger factor in determining like the Black incarceration rate. But as segregation increases, segregation is actually a bigger factor in determining the Black incarceration rate. So in places with high levels of segregation, it's actually where Black crime is at its lowest, but we have an extraordinarily high Black incarceration rate. So the second test was a multi-level logistic regression, where I wanted to see the effects separately and controlling for each other. So essentially, in places where higher levels of segregation, all else equal, and across the board, segregation actually had higher rates of the Black prison population. Specifically, I tested Black prisoners over the total number of prisoners. So it's the proportion of the prison system that were African Americans. So segregation, the percentage of the community that was Black, so controlling for the size of the Black population in that area. That also was positively associated with the Black population in the prison system, and Black crime also was positively associated. Interestingly, though, and I may have run one too many regressions, but the income in the neighborhood wasn't a big factor, but poverty was. So more people on SNAP benefits was actually associated with lower levels of both overall crime and the percentage of the population that was Black. And perhaps even more interestingly, and this runs counter to one of my mentors' work, is that Black representation didn't actually affect the Black prison population, which was like, I suppose that, I mean, it makes sense, but it's a bit anomalous. And then every model that I ran, those two kept popping up. So I don't know why, but that was there. Um, yeah. So the third test that I ran was, and this was to strike at kind of the heart of the whole theory, because the idea is that there's a triadic relationship that's kind of impervious to like any real like way to fix it, was that segregation increases Black crime, which facilitates a higher, or which causes a higher level of Black incarceration, and the arrow runs the other way. So Black crime creates more segregation, and that segregation induced by Black crime increased the Black incarceration rate. Those effects were significant across the board. And there was also a direct effect between segregation and Black crime on the Black incarceration rate. I tested one ameliorative policy, and that was increasing college enrollment, but that didn't do anything either. So like higher rates of college enrollment, particularly in areas where there's a high Black population, actually induce higher rates of segregation. I think because of the same sorting purposes that I outlined in the beginning, the idea being that you go to college and then you finish with a higher socioeconomic standing, and as a white American, you sort into a neighborhood that matches your ethnic profile, leading to more segregation, and the same process that leads to higher levels of Black incarceration. So yeah, so the primary finding is that there's a two-way causality between segregation and Black criminality. So segregation induced by Black crime and Black crime induced by segregation both positively increase the incarceration rate for African Americans. And college enrollment actually made the system much worse, significantly worse. So yeah, that division between segregation and segregation and Black crime, that's essentially separating the two populations, is what I'm calling the socio-political bifurcation. Because once they've sorted into that neighborhood, there's a few other things that happens that leads to disproportionate incarceration. One of them is being that they advocate for policies that disproportionately impact the Black community. So you have to imagine a racially homogenous community, and that when they have to decide upon which legislation to pass, it's typically things that disproportionately impacts us. So yeah, that's it. I think you're muted. Are you saying something? Because you're muted.
I'm sorry. I apologize for that. Thank you, Mr. Lindsay, the future Dr. Lindsay.
God willing.
Okay, and our final presenter is Alexander Goodwin from the University of North Texas, and he'll be presenting on poverty and police shootings, examining the link between income inequality and officer-involved shootings.
All right, I can share my
screen. So at this time, Mr. Goodwin.
All right. Can everybody see my screen?
I see you right now.
Let's see what's going on. Let's see.
Hey, it started to load.
All right, and all right. Can everybody see my title slide?
Yes.
All righty. So, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alexander Goodwin. I am a doctoral student at the University of North Texas. And for the brief few minutes I have with you guys, I will be talking about my project entitled Inequality, Racial Residential Segregation, and the Occurrence of Fatal Police Shootings. So my two primary research questions are, is income inequality a substantive predictor of police shootings at the county level? My second question being, how does income inequality interact with racial residential segregation to predict police shootings? So some of the previous literature on police shootings, the overwhelming majority of it is at the individual level. So they focus on things such as victim race, gender, officer race, or presence of a weapon. And some of that research has shown that the use of force against a suspect is more likely and more severe in cases when the officers involved are less experienced or possess lower levels of educational attainment, while other work shows that male suspects, members of non-white racial groups, and those of lower socioeconomic status are more likely to have force used against them in encounters with police. There's another line of literature that focuses on the more contextual, structural, and ecological variables that could predict police shootings. And those things are variables such as neighborhood, racial demographics, socioeconomic status, and jurisdictional crime. And that work has indicated that racial composition and violent crime rates are associated with higher probabilities of excessive force and fatal officer-involved shootings. Though the role of socioeconomic status, it's a bit less conclusive. So what I think my work will add to this growing body of literature is that as most scholars are trying to understand the phenomena of police shootings and explain this black-white disparity in police shootings, so much of it is so often focused on the level of the individual, when I think there are many more structural, institutional level variables that we have to consider. In addition, the majority of the work in this area, it's either focused on a single year or a single case in a single city or a single state. So I think using a broader data set will help us here. So this leads to my theory and my hypotheses. So scholarship has long indicated that poor communities of color are hyper-targeted and overrepresented in individual level interactions with police. So poor communities are most often targeted for broken windows policing ordinances, things like loitering, vandalism, fare evasion, and public intoxication. Poor communities are also more likely to bear the brunt of street level police initiatives such as stop and frisk. So for example, in 2008, Black New Yorkers composed of 85% of all stop and frisk cases, with the highest concentration occurring in the Brooklyn neighborhood of Brownsville, where the median household income is nearly 50% below the average. Brownsville residents were stopped at a rate 13 times higher than the average New Yorker. In addition, other research from Weitzer and Brunson note that when policing in poor neighborhoods, officers are more likely to engage in corruption, use of force, coercion, and more likely to physically and verbally abuse citizens. That leads to my first hypothesis being that fatal police shootings are more likely to occur in areas with higher levels of economic inequality. Right here. So for my second and third hypotheses, this focuses on racial residential segregation. So Wright et al. 2020 demonstrates that police car stops and vehicle searches are more likely in segregated areas, primarily occupied by African Americans. Other work from Siegel as well as Smith and Holmes suggests fatal encounters are more likely in areas with elevated levels of racial residential segregation at the national level. And Misek et al. 2018 reaches a similar conclusion for state level segregation. So that leads to hypothesis number 2, that fatal police shootings are more likely to occur in areas with higher levels of racial residential segregation. My final hypothesis interacts the two. So a growing body of, not even a growing body, a large body of sociological literature indicates that when paired together, income inequality and racial residential segregation, there are disastrous effects. There leads to things such as food insecurity, COVID-19 rate disparities, as well as crime rates. I believe this trend will continue as in reference to police shootings. So my third hypothesis being the effect of income inequality on incidents of crime or fatal police shootings is conditional on the level of racial residential segregation. So my data, I use data from the Mapping Police Violence data set from the years of 2013 and 2019. That was merged with census zip code level data, the number of observations in my study was 3,448. As far as methods are concerned, my measure of racial residential segregation, I use a dissimilarity index. For my measure of income inequality, I use a Gini coefficient as a measure of within county wealth distribution. For my dependent variable, police shootings were coded dichotomously. Coded 1 if a shooting occurred, 0 if there was no shooting. And for my controls, I control for violent crime per capita, property crime per capita, police presence per capita. And for my model, I ran a hierarchical logistic regression model. I have 4 models in my present study. So there's one model that has all shooting victims in it, which is Black, White, Asian, Latino. And the second model there with the multiracial shooting model interacts income inequality and racial residential segregation. And then I have a second set of models that only includes Black shooting victims without the interaction between racial residential segregation and income inequality, and the last model with that interaction in it. So here are my results with our odds ratios. I forgot to put my regression results in there. That's totally my apologies here, but you can just briefly look through our table here and see how the odds increase or decrease with our interaction term. And I have a few graphical representations as well here on the next slide. So with a graphical representation, our figure on the left, it shows that in our full sample that officer-involved shootings were 4 times more likely to occur in areas of extreme inequality and twice as likely in locations with average levels of economic inequality. The impact of segregation is pronounced in line with my theoretical expectations at the average level of Black-white racial segregation, approximately 0.39 on our dissimilarity index from our data. The model predicts the overall chance of fatal police shootings occurring in a given county is around 8%. As the level of racial residential segregation increases, that number increases as well. However, the probability of fatal police encounters as the level of racial residential segregation within a county increases, the probability of a fatal police shooting encounter climbs sharply, more than tripling by the time it reaches a full standard deviation from our average level. And here is a map in which there is on the far right side where it says segregation, the lighter the color gets is the more racially residentially segregated this area is. And down here, these larger dots are indicative of the more likely of police shootings in these given areas. And if you notice here, these are large metropolitan areas. So this is Houston, this is Dallas, this is Austin, Texas, San Antonio, Texas. You go even further, this is San Diego, Los Angeles, Chicago. This is Northeast Philadelphia, New Jersey, New York City, Atlanta, Jacksonville, Miami, all through there. So as racial residential segregation increases, fatal police shootings increase as well, in line with my theoretical expectations. Lastly, for my third hypothesis, looking at the influence of segregation and inequality, this final figure shows that the effect of segregation on the probability of fatal police shootings is conditioned at various levels of inequality, as I previously expected. And as we can look here, as -1, our purple indicator here, probability of police shootings extremely low at our highest level being 2 of our yellow indicator, the interaction between residential segregation and income inequality, it's much higher. So in conclusion, I find preliminary support for my 3 hypotheses, which indicate that income inequality and racial residential segregation are, in fact, significant predictors of police shootings at the county level. Future iterations of my work will aim to disaggregate this data down to the census tract level, and I plan to control for more structural and individual level variables, such as whether the victim was armed or unarmed, gender, educational attainment in the given census tract, rates of interpersonal violence in the census tract, as well as officer race. I thank you guys for your time and your attention. I look forward to all of your comments. Thank you. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry again. I did again. Sorry again. Thank you, Mr. Goodwin. That's an excellent presentation. Actually, these were 3 excellent presentations. And it's actually it's a privilege listening to these up and coming political scientists. I see a lot of overlap in your research, and I look forward maybe one day reading about some of the collaborations that you all have done, because I see a lot of synergy in what you're doing, and it looks like the discipline is in good hands. At this time, I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Johnson, and she's gonna make a few comments on your papers, and probably give you an opportunity to maybe respond or ask any questions you may have. And then following that, we're going to open it up for Q&A for audience members to weigh in. So, Dr. Johnson, are you ready now with your comments?
Yes, finally I'm in order. And I'm going to piggyback off of Dr. Samuels and say that all of your presentations were absolutely great. And I definitely see an overlap in what you all are discussing, and look for collaboration between you 3 scholars in the future. I want to start off, and as I did earlier, to discuss Ms. Best, your presentation on the Voices Unheard, Stories Untold, Black Women, Police Violence, and Political Participation. I actually have a question about the use of Black feminist consciousness. Are you going to utilize that as your theoretical framework and intertwine that into your work?
So right now, Black feminist consciousness kind of serves as a mediator within the framework. Just right now, I'm still trying to figure out how to incorporate the differences between like a Black feminist consciousness versus what people would consider to be a linked fate, or a Black woman's linked fate. Because I think that there are a couple of differences in how Black women see these 2 ideas, or these 2 things, group identity versus what they're willing to do for their group. So it's definitely a part of my framework. I don't know if it's the actual framework that I'm using for the entire project.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions they'd like to ask Ms. Best? Maybe I'll make my comments first, and then I'll open the floor for Q&A. That's what I'll do. Okay, thank you. Mr. Lindsay, on social political bifurcation, the segregation crime feedback loop, driving disproportionate Black imprisonment. Very good presentation. I enjoyed the presentation very much. I do have a question about your data sets that you actually utilize in your study, and I noticed that the time frames differ. How did you, or did you take into consideration when running your data sets the different time frames with in looking at the data sets that you use, whether or not your data would come out correctly or not?
Yeah. So some of the data that I have, it extended all the way back to 1860, like the congressional representation within the United States. That extended quite far. But some of the data on incarceration at the state level only went back as far as 1960. So obviously there had to be a cutoff. So I got bottlenecked by certain variables. So that kind of sucked. But as far as like actually accounting for the the difference across time. So like a time series analysis or accounting for the residual effects from one observation to the other. Yeah, I used a multi-level logistic regression, and the one of the variables at the state level, it was state nested in region, and also control for year, so year over year effects.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. And last but not least, Mr. Goodwin, inequality, racial segregation, and the occurrence of fatal police shootings. I found that I really like the fact that you're looking at the structural factors such as income inequality and the residential segregation. I wouldn't have ever thought to think about that, you know, in looking at the occurrence of shootings. So I'm really happy to see that you're using that as a variable. I wanted to ask you as well about the economic uh, inequality you discussed, because economic inequality and income is tied in so closely. Will you be using that, and how will you measure that? And I guess the question is, why did you choose both
Um,
to look at?
on I use the terms interchangeably, and I probably shouldn't have. I think so. That's probably what's causing like a bit of the confusion, because once I like read back through the paper, I said, all right, I use these as if they were synonyms, and they're measured a bit differently. So I probably need to clean that up. But I'll probably just be using the Gini coefficient for within county wealth distribution that I used here. But, and, you know, just clean up any sort of, you know, misunderstanding theoretically as far as that term.
Right, and I think that will help you a lot with your, you know, in your findings. You'll be able to explain them clearly, and you won't have any questions with what you've hypothesized and in your findings, giving the correct information, which will be very helpful to you. But I enjoyed your paper as well.
Okay.
I actually have one suggestion before we go to Q&A for Ms. Best in terms of your theoretical framework. And actually I'll be happy to speak with you after the session is over. I would suggest to you not to utilize more than one theoretical framework in your paper, if possible. When you dive into utilizing more than one, it causes, it's just a lot more work involved. So, and I'll be happy to email you and we can talk about that later. But overall, I have thoroughly enjoyed your papers and this discussion. Now I'm going to open the floor up for Q&A.
Now, before we proceed, real quick, I want to jump in just for one quick second, and then we're going to open up a little bit. There's one comment that I would make, and this is probably more directed toward Mr. Lindsay's paper, because you were talking about segregation and how we're talking about segregation, and initially some of your analysis you were talking in the beginning, you were talking about some of the structural factors, and then when you talk about the decisions of people and where they're going to move, you talk a lot about individual choices. And I would encourage you, if you haven't consulted this already, is to read the Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. To the extent that a lot of people think about segregation as the choices that people are making, that there is a long historical and structural basis to segregation. That the government segregated America from discriminatory lending practices to zoning, and even in the private sector to various kind of homeowner associations. That's a long structural process, and so a lot of those individual decisions in the context of the structure that's been created, they have a certain rationality, of their own, but they're not just individual decisions. Decision, the neighborhoods have been structured a certain way and a certain way, and then the economy is structured a certain way, and then when jobs move to other places and the amenities move. So these are not just individual decisions that people are making, but they're also a part of a structure. So I would just encourage you to think about that. Okay. At this time, I want to stop, and I want to open the floor for anyone who wants to make a comment or raise a question for any of these young scholars.
Hi everyone. I thought all your presentations were great. I had some comments for Ayana and Anthony. Anthony, there's a book by Ryan Enos about like intergroup contact theory that I think would be really useful for you. It talks about how essentially when white people have contact with people outside of their racial group, they develop like negative affect towards the racial group. So that seems like it could be really helpful for you. And Ayana, I love your project. I study Black women in BLM, so I'm incredibly biased to love your project. And your project reminded me of Beth Ritchie's Arrested Justice. I don't know if you've already read it, but I think it would be really helpful for you in talking about like Black women and police contact and how they react to it. And I would also like to ask you, why are you using a snowball method for your sampling instead of outsourcing it through like Prolific or Dynata?
So the primary, I am actually outsourcing it through Lucid. However, it's I haven't received much funding for my project. So the snowballing method is free. And that's the primary reason why I'm doing that first, to try to gauge as many respondents that way as possible. And then I will be outsourcing to Lucid to gain the rest of the responses that I don't get.
Hey, my name's Greg. I thought all your presentations were pretty dope. I had just a comment for Anthony. You said that you measured to try to see if there was an effect of co-racial representation on your outcomes. And I think you mean congressional level. But when I think of congressional level, I think that's a little bit kind of abstract. And I'm wondering if you might have better luck if you look at the race of the mayors or maybe the composition of the city council. Or most importantly, the police chief, if that's something that's elected. And again, I forget your data set, but I forget if it's big enough for this, but one empirical strategy you might try is to do an RD if you have two cities where there's one who has a Black police chief and one who has a white police chief. And if you look at people within maybe 100 or yards or a mile from the border or something, I'd be able to get some leverage over that. Or also, if you wanted to talk about whether you think the police chief might be more effective than the congressional member. I also had a question for Ayana. You mentioned that when we talk about police violence, we all of a sudden it augurs this idea of Black men, and it kind of leaves women out of the conversation. And so it made me think, when we have the linked fate question, you have a specific question about linked fate for Black women. And I'm wondering if maybe when we think of linked fate, it's similar to that, or I'm wondering if there's a gendered effect. And so I'm sure you thought about it, but could you talk a little bit about whether you expect Black women to have a different response to the specific Black women linked fate question versus the general linked fate question? And then I think since your theoretical goal is to kind of show there's a unique relationship between Black women and these certain outcomes, in your models, I would encourage you to compete those two measures directly against each other, and maybe even interact them to see if to kind of isolate that it is a relationship specifically for Black women. But have you thought about whether you might see Black women who are high on Black women linked fate, but not on general linked fate, and why you think that might be?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I'll go first to answer the question. But for the question about the linked fate, I'm still grappling with this because most of the literature doesn't disaggregate when we're talking about Black women versus Black men in the linked fate question. So I wanted to specifically get at if Black women like kind of develop off of the sense of a group consciousness if Black women felt more of a tie to other Black women versus the Black community as a whole. Because in my reading of the literature, I find that Black women are more, they think about the link fate question as more of their familiar ties, like their fathers or their husbands or their sons, etc. And what is happening to them, or they see primarily men in different aspects of the news media or police violence happening to them, so they don't associate like this idea of what's happening to Black women or affecting them, essentially, because they don't see it. So I don't actually ask a question about like link fate generally, which I may need to think about. It's just I asked the question about how they feel about their linkage, I guess,
Oh, I
to
see.
Black women only.
I think the CMPS will have they'll have, I don't know if you included that measure on the CMPS, but they'll definitely have a bunch of different other linked fate ones.
Yeah, so definitely that's why I'm using the 2020 CMPS. So hopefully I can get that variation from that survey and then compare it to what I have or what I get from my survey.
Great project.
Thank you.
Now, I think Maria had a question in the chat. You want to share it?
Sure. First of all, thank you. This was really insightful. Yeah, you could see it in the chat, but I'd asked if for Ms. Best, if your research just focused on cisgendered Black women, or was it a wide range of the spectrum of Black women? So, for example, did you also include trans Black women and then their experiences with police violence and their linkage and etc.? And if so, can you like explain why?
So my project isn't necessarily solely focusing on cisgendered Black women. I leave it to it's a survey. So I leave it to how these Black women identify for themselves. However, I am working on a separate project that is similar to the same idea as this, with just specifically masculine presenting Black women and trans Black women, and how they're pretty much erasure from even the Say Her Name movement or movements that are trying to address Black women, how that affects, them specifically. But I do look at it as kind of a separate project in the actual literature. So.
Sorry. Hi everyone. I was thankful for all the projects I was able to see. I specifically gravitated toward Ayana's project specifically because I'm interested in stereotyping and how that relates to Black women and their political decisions. And I thought a lot about how Melissa Harris Perry in her book talks about how Black women seek to be actively involved in politics and like race-related issues to subvert the mammy stereotype. So I was really interested in your questions and your research. I had a specific question for Anthony. In your test too, you said that there was a representation variable that had a 0 result. And I was interested to ask what that variable included and why do you think that representation had no effect in that specific test?
All right, so, and this goes for your question and Gregory's as well, his comment as well. I think it's because it was too high. Like, I think it was essentially I looked at congressional representation or the proportion of the representatives from that state in Congress. It was at the federal level. I think if you look at the state level representatives, like Greg suggested, like looking at the state level representatives, I think that you would see a huge result. And I didn't consider the police chief or the makeup of the police force either, but that'll probably be huge as well. But yeah, for it being no effect, it's because it's a federal representative. I don't think that they're really advocating that much for the actual like on the ground situation in their state. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I think Professor King Meadows been trying to get in.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a question for the Goodwin paper and a question for the Lindsay paper. I'll start with the Goodwin paper. Given that you showed us the tail ends on your in your figure, I have a question between the dependent variable and income inequality. Um, is it where the person got shot, or is it where they come from? So, given the mapping project, are you looking at the police involved shooting and income inequality from where the person hails from or where the incident occurred? Because there are two different trajectories based upon how you're conceptualizing the income inequality of the district where that person is coming from or the census tract where that person is coming from versus where it happened.
Mhm. That's a very good question. What we're looking at is like where the incident itself happened. So in like the mapping police violence data set, it tells you exactly like where this
Right.
incident happened, street, all those other different, just like in the descriptions. So we really don't have that data didn't provide any information about where specifically that person lived, just where that encounter occurred.
Okay, so yes, that's important because it ties into a narrative about, which is why I'm going to the Lindsay paper. Incarcerated in federal prison or state prison. So this goes back to your conceptual link between representation and being able to move the actual dependent variable that you're looking at. So members of Congress don't have control over the incarceration rates at the state level. So they have control. This goes back to Gregory's point. So I'm interested in your perception of how the change would have at the tail ends of whatever your descriptive representation variable is.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. So I think it's observing African American imprisonment at the state level. So it's interesting because when I sent the paper to Chris Clark, my mentor at UNC, he had the same objection. He studies descriptive representation at the state level, and he found in his book that it did have an effect. So that was the essentially the next step is to observe like what happens at the state level. Um, yeah, yeah. I'm curious though, like what the distribution will be because there's so many states where there's essentially no black representatives, and then you have other states where there is actually like an abundance of them, but only for a very brief time span. So I'm wondering if there is a discontinuity between the time before the black representatives had a chance to actually push some legislation and after, and that seems like you said, a regression discontinuity design seems like it should fit well.
Yeah, that's what Gregory was talking about. Look at the
Yeah.
DOJ because the federal representatives can help through their process get the DOJ to do certain things. So a member of Congress can't really control where these individuals are incarcerated. I mean, if they're in federal prison, then they're going different places, right? So you get arrested in Maryland and you're in Alabama, right? You're in federal prison in Alabama. So you might want to disaggregate that just to give
Mm.
us a different what your theoretical construct actually is measuring.
Yeah, yeah, that makes perfect sense. So if the idea was to make if I needed a proxy for black political power. So the idea being that if you were actually able to get a black representative, be it in the federal Congress or your local state representative, the more the larger the proportion of black representatives you had, well then black should have a more political power in that state. But it's like that didn't hold up. But I think I'll find a better proxy for black political
That's
power.
that's presuming two things, and this goes back to Gregory's point. That's presuming two things: that A, they have power over the levers, right?
Mm.
So what if they don't have power over the levers? That's number one. And number two, numbers don't mean empowerment, right? So you could have a bunch of people in a state, but don't have the power over the very levers that you're actually measuring, right?
Mm.
So you have to think about that. That's why if a white and a black police chief, and then you see this trajectory, by using a regression discontinuity design, then you can make an argument that somebody has the actual levers of power. And that's why I asked Alex about the tails. At the tail end, what do you think your dependent variable is going to look like at the very tail end of your independent variable? So maximum black political representation, right? Maximum income inequality at 2 standard deviations. What your dependent variable actually looks like?
High, like California or DC. So DC, like as a large proportion of Black representatives, and has one of the higher Black incarceration rates. But it's like, I don't know. I'd have to see. Like, I have to look at it.
Thank you.
Okay, we're running short on time here. We probably got about another 2 or 3 minutes. Does someone else have a quick question they want to ask one of the panelists? I don't want us to have the panel shut up on us.
Oh, actually, so I had a comment actually. If
Okay.
just a quick minute. So the Ayana, your second survey instrument, the where you're essentially looking at link fate. Like I thought that was perfect. Like I know that's not like the focus of the project itself, but it's not asked very much in surveys. I only know because we just launched like 4 of them, and like we wanted to look at like Black hope over time, and turns out they don't ask very many specific questions to Black people like at all. So the GSS, ANES, and a few of the larger surveys we normally tap into, that didn't do anything at all. So that question is really important. So like don't drop that. The other part was you talked about the funding for these surveys. So at UNC, we have a subject pool of students, the political science students, that we can essentially fill the survey with just them. So I don't know if you want to send me your email, but I can take your question and then fill that with my like next like dozen or so surveys that we do on just that field. And then yeah, I think
Can I
that's
sneak in one more comment?
Yes.
Anthony, one thing I was thinking, a Crystal, fellow student at UCLA here, mentioned Brown Enos's project, and it's essentially like when you have an influx of members from the racial outgroup, it increases the affective prejudice for that group temporarily and then leaves, right? And then similarly, when that when there's a exodus of outgroup members in your space, then you become like less racially opposing. Have you looked at trends in demographic change over time? Since you have a lot of different, since you go back, I guess, for a long time, if you look at a state and see if the state or whatever location you have, see if it increases in the percent Black, if you then see like a larger effect of white people being more opposition towards Blacks. And then similarly, if you see a decrease, I guess you'd have to control for the proportion of race beforehand. But if you see, if there's states that become less Black, if that decreases the amount of affective prejudice towards Blacks in kind of an overtime effect.
mm-hmm. I don't know if I had time to respond, but that sounds like a hell of an idea.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I think we're out of time. This has been a wonderful panel, and I look forward to I look forward to seeing you guys in the future and seeing your work. Thank you everyone.